Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of that Encyclopedia podcast with your hosts, Jacob and Will.
Hello.
Today we're doing a video that should be made available around New Year, but I think it's thematically a bit of a Halloween-themed video, because we are discussing vampires, both the modern, pale, suave, intelligent, charismatic, sexy vampires, as well as the more traditional, old-school, medieval, bloated, ruddy, blood-filled demons from hell sort of vampires, and all things paranormal related to it. I must say I'm quite excited actually to discuss vampires, because it's the sort of thing that is a cultural connection to our collective past, right? Like, I am familiar with vampire books and films and video games and other cultural phenomena that were only created in my lifetime, but if I went back hundreds and hundreds of years, I could find recognizable relationships between those entities and the cultural phenomena that would have existed at the time. And I think that's exceptionally cool. So, Will, what are your thoughts on blood-sucking horrors of the night?
Well, yeah, vampires are cool. Vampires are interesting. Vampires have a history that, certainly in the West, there is a broad past. Before the 18th, 19th centuries, I think it's fair to say that the concept of vampire is very different to the concept of vampire today, as you alluded to in the intro. So the archetype, I think, although it differs between fictional universes, I guess you could say. I'm sure you're aware of more than one fictional vampire series or movie that depicts vampires slightly differently, but there are some common attributes that are pretty consistent. As you said, pale, often nicely dressed, possibly intelligent, averse to light, averse to garlic, holy symbols and whatnot. But before the 18th, 19th centuries, around the time that the tale of Dracula was written by Bram Stoker, the concept of vampire was a bit different, and it was different in different parts of the world. And I suppose you could say it is still different in different parts of the world. It depends what you consider a vampire. But yeah, my favourite part of the article has to be the discussion of, well, there's two parts I like. There's the different types of vampire in different parts of the world, and the theories behind the origin of vampire beliefs. But now I'll throw it over to you. What do you think?
Well, I think my favourite part of the article is actually the very first sentence, and that's not a cop-out, I promise. There's a very good reason for that. I'll read it to you. It says, "A vampire is a mythical creature that subsists by feeding on the vital essence, bracket, generally in the form of blood, close bracket, of the living." Now, there's sometimes a game that I like to play with Wikipedia articles where on concepts or events or activities or things or people that I'm familiar with already, where I'll start reading the article and I'll see how long it is before something surprises me, and rarely is that in the first sentence. Because I would say, and I'm sure you would agree, Will, that maybe the most important cultural commonality between our understanding of vampires in the 21st century is a desire to feed on blood, or a subsistence by feeding on blood, right?
Oh, I thought you were going to say they're not mythical, they're real.
I mean, there was a discussion of modern vampire hunters later, further down the article, but no.
No, I agree. That's definitely a sticking point to the modern vampire archetype. I've not come across a vampire in a modern story that doesn't feed on blood in some form, except Marceline from Adventure Time. I don't know if you've come across her. So it's half true with her, but she feeds on the color red. So
I like that, actually. It's a nice twist. I didn't know that. No, I'm not familiar with Adventure Time. My one example, I also have only one example, and it would be a character called Colin Robinson from the TV show What We Do in the Shadows, which is one of Taika Waititi's masterpieces, which is a satirical comedy, and Colin Robinson is an energy vampire who feeds on the goodwill and enthusiasm for life of the people around him. So he just finds himself in dead-end office jobs and makes people fall asleep by literally sucking the energy out of them by just being really boring to talk to. But the broader point here being that, according to Wikipedia at least, the definition of a vampire is, or the most basic trait of a vampire, is not necessarily feeding on blood, but rather by feeding on a person's vital essence. And although that's normally considered to be blood for the purposes of vampirism, if you are willing to accept that the vital essence could be something else, then suddenly the rest of the world opens its doors to enable us to understand their mythologies as vampiric creatures, other entities and demons and horrors and things that go bump in the night, that might functionally be vampires but technically don't feed on blood but on something else, are still vampires. Just with that one slight change, and it hit you over the head in the very first sentence. So to me, that's the most compelling part of this article. That, and actually the in modern culture section, because I really enjoy, as I mentioned, feeling immersed in my own personal links between the ancient past and the modern day. What else sort of struck you reading this? Anything catch you off guard, or anything that you disagree with in the article, maybe? I don't know.
I didn't notice anything that I would say I disagree with. But on another note, a more particular note of interest, I enjoyed the theory that some of the folk beliefs, certainly some of the European folk beliefs around vampires, could be related to poor understanding of decomposition of human bodies. Did you read that section?
I did. In fact, I was going to ask you about porphyria. In your capacity as a medical student, are you familiar with porphyria?
I mean, I've heard of it before, but only in these weird settings of trying to... I can't remember exactly where it came up. I feel like it was another Wikipedia article trying to link a rare condition with something else of interest. But again, so just for anyone listening, porphyria is a term for a group of disorders of the liver, which cause a build-up of chemicals called porphyrins in the body. And there was a biochemist in 1985 that proposed a link between porphyria and vampire folklore, because porphyria can be treated by basically putting heme, or a major component of blood, the component that gives it its red colour, into the body, and therefore he suggested that consuming blood could somehow treat porphyria, and maybe vampires were people with porphyria who were treating it by drinking blood, although there's not really any evidence that this would work to treat your porphyria, or that anyone would have the urge to try it, or that it was actually done. But to be fair to this biochemist, he did not publish his work broadly. It was just an idea.
I love the idea, though, that it starts from the premise that vampires exist, and is trying to rationalize their existence by saying, "Oh, yeah, they're just people with porphyria who have a instinctual understanding of their disease uniquely, and know that somehow by drinking blood that it alleviates their symptoms," as opposed to instead working from the question, does a vampire exist? David Dolphin started from the more engaging assumption that vampires do exist, and worked backwards from there, which I think is brilliant. So that stood out to me in particular, but the whole section on the links between vampiric folkloric beliefs in vampirism and various pathologies was a very, very interesting section.
Well, if I could link the decomposition section with the one of the descriptions you gave of an old school folklore vampire. So if you were to describe a figure who wears a shroud, has a bloated, ruddy appearance, dark countenance, this could fit along with the some of the other stories given around, like people believing to have encountered vampires, or you dig up a corpse to see whether it was undead, or if there's evidence of it being undead. It could certainly be. I could certainly see some feasibility here in the decomposition section. So this concept of if a very thin, gaunt person were to pass away, you might find upon digging up their body that they are plumper than they were from production of gas. The increased internal pressure could cause blood to ooze from the mouth, for example. But I don't need to go into any more detail than that. I think the idea is conveyed that there are certain changes that could happen which to the untrained eye might be evidence that a body looks in fact more alive than it was when the individual who I suppose inhabited the body passed away.
Right, you start by being a pale, skinny individual, and then you die, and you're dug up weeks later, and you've suddenly become bloated and ruddy. You actually look a lot more healthy, particularly to maybe a more medieval or pre-industrial society than you did when you were alive.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. These are these sort of medical explanations really help to establish why vampiric-like creatures appear independently in folklores across the planet, right? Because all cultures have to deal with death and decay, decomposition and burial in one form or another. So it really crosses all of those boundaries, and so you have this creature or this prototypical creature emerging in most cultures in some form. It's quite elegant, really.
Yeah.
So let's turn to modern depictions of vampires then. Are you a horror fan in general, just broadly, of the genre?
I'm not a horror super fan, but I'm not against horror. I'm partial to some horror, let's say.
And well, do you have if someone came to you and wanted recommendations for a go-to vampire film or book or depiction in modern culture, would you have a strong recommendation towards any particular product?
Well, there is a series that follows vampires that I quite like, but I know you like it too. The Castlevania animated Netflix series.
That's yeah, absolutely. I'll go with that. I love It's a good series, Pennsylvania. And that kind of swerves us into Dracula, doesn't it? As a character.
Yes, it does. Yes.
As a there's probably some fancy adjective that's eluding me, but as a character who appears across different media, Dracula is the prototypical, the ultimate, not quite the original, of course, but certainly the most domineering depiction of a modern vampire in the world's cultures today, and has been for over 100 years now.
Certainly a character important in the sort of defining and popularizing the current vampire archetype.
Well, I have a book suggestion, actually, I think, for something a bit different. It doesn't appear in the article, but for anyone who wants a different take on vampires, if they're maybe saturated, fed up with Dracula-like figures, or they don't have the time or tolerance for kind of classic films or texts, I actually suggest a book called The Passage, which is a post-apocalyptic novel. I think it's the first of a trilogy, actually, although I haven't read the other two, where a team of scientists are researching vampire bats in South America, deep in the jungles, and inadvertently someone gets infected with some variant of rabies or other disease from one of these vampire bats, and ends up being experimented on by the US military. Standard stuff. It all goes wrong. It becomes sort of like a zombie apocalypse, except instead of zombies, it's vampires or vampiric people. And then the book explains the downfall of civilization through the perspective of an FBI agent in its first half. And then in its second half, it suddenly accelerates to about 100 years later, where the world has ended and people live in little walled communities like Dying Light, kind of defending themselves with UV light at night, because most of the world's population of humans have been turned into very quick, rabid-like vampire creatures. It's something a bit different, actually, and it's the only time I've felt vampires have been intimidating, because I normally feel like I could have a good crack at just engaging in some sort of rhetorical argument with a vampire and convincing it to leave me alone. You know, there's something very, very old school Victorian about a paternalistic figure clad in black leering over you. I mean, if anyone, a lot of people probably grew up with those sorts of figures, you know, at school.
a civilized monstrosity.
Well, precisely. It's that juxtaposition that makes them sort of interesting initially. Yeah.
What about the Twilight series?
Well,
You're a fan of the Twilight series of movies? Have you seen all of them?
I think I've seen the first two. See, I actually saw the first one, this first film. Obviously, it's a book series first and foremost, but I saw the first film not in the cinema, but pretty much as soon as it came out on DVD afterwards, because I had I still do, I have a cousin who was very into it at the time, and I think she said to me that it was a vampire film, and I thought, oh, cool, and I watched it, and I found it fine. I thought it was fine. It's often the case with films I've grown up with, whereby they are sort of fine for the first one and then kind of go off the rails. Like the first Twilight, I think, is fine for what it does. The first Transformers film, I think, is fine for what it tries to do. I could go on, but to answer your question, I have seen a few of the Twilight films, and I think the first one's fine.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Definitely feels like it goes downhill from there, but that said, I understand why it's a well, it was. I don't know if it still is. Certainly, when we were younger teens, a popular series among our cohort.
Yeah. Actually, you've just inspired a connection that I hadn't really made on vampires. Is in that when you read this article, it stresses that as we've said, the original or early depictions of vampires, at least in Western folklore, the emphasis was very much on the destruction of vital essences, usually blood. But as time has gone on, the proportion of vampiric depictions showing essentially sexy vampires, right? Like seductive, alluring, charming, hypnotic entities has increased proportionally. We do have examples of in certain folklores of vampiric creatures sort of pretending to be beautiful young women or young men by day and then transforming into horrific monsters by night. But I think that's slightly different in that more recent depictions of vampires don't have an emphasis on this binary transformation, by day, by night, but just in the disposition of vampires being inherently attractive, that their true form is a seductive form. So sort of sex and sexuality and romance has become more closely entwined with vampires as time has gone on. Do you think that's would you agree with that assessment?
I think so, although I'm not sure how well placed I am to agree or disagree. It fits with what I've seen, I suppose. I've not seen enough of the more historic media depictions of vampires. That's something I should consider. I can recognize Nosferatu, but I've never seen it, for example.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. Fair enough. That's a good hand example. Yeah. I think the only other thing that I wanted to mention really is that the technical term for an animal surviving on or feeding on blood explicitly in the real world is called hematophagy. Obviously, hemato meaning blood, and then anything phage meaning eating and consuming from the Greek. So vampire bats are a real animal that engage in this practice, but it's more often seen from smaller animals like certain kind of bloodworms or little arthropods. So there are vampires in nature, just perhaps not humans.
Yeah, and on vampire bats and their relation, they tie in a little bit with some of the other theories and other depictions of vampires, but it's important to note that within European folklore, it's certainly unlikely that vampires were influenced by the vampire bat, given their discovery to Europe would have been much later than when vampires were really emerging. Although, of course, they've definitely woven their way in. They're mentioned within the story of Dracula, and they're kind of a nice find because I believe bats were associated with vampires before it was known that there's a vampire bat that goes around feeding on blood as its main source of food. So that's quite a nice find. Yeah,
if you were a vampire conspiracist, a modern day hardcore believer, vampire hunter, and a species of bat has just been discovered that survives through hematophagy, you must be jumping for joy, right? You'd feel so vindicated. But it is an example of a bit of selective reasoning, no, but of course, excellent. Yeah, I think we've done quite a good job of covering all of our bases with vampires, but there is one question that I have been meaning to ask you on this. If you had to choose, like you do in Skyrim, about being a vampire or a werewolf, which would you choose?
Ooh, that's a challenging question. See, I don't know. I suppose in its open form, I could even choose which depiction of a vampire maybe that I would be forced into being.
That's true.
Think one of the common features in werewolves, I haven't read the Wikipedia page, so it's not a totally fair assessment, is a sort of lack of free will and going full beast mode when you're afflicted by lycanthropy. Now I feel like I'd probably have more control over myself if I were a vampire. Although I might have to... I might be in a permanent state of committing evil acts. I'm not sure. But let's say vampire. Vampire for the autonomy. How about you?
I think I'd agree. I think vampires have a more diverse range of powers in general. Lycanthropy is always seen as a curse. Well, that's not really true. Well, it is in modern depictions, mostly. A good counterexample would be Twilight, actually. But there you go. But my broader reason would be that in a lot of depictions, vampires can turn into wolves anyway. I'm pretty sure Dracula does at least once, or is said to be able to. It's been a while since I've read the novel, but yeah, I think I would also choose vampire. They're one of my favourite horror staples, for sure.
Do I get to live in a big stately home in the countryside if I become a vampire as well?
That is the modern appeal of the vampire is you get to own property.
Yes.
Whereas if you're a werewolf, you get to live in the woods eating like anything you can find.
Also, I'm pretty sure like every time you transform, you tear whatever clothes you're wearing. So you'd have to go around naked if you're planning on going back and forth.
Yeah. Well, I think this more or less concludes this episode of That Encyclopedia podcast. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.